My name is Phil Cutting, and I'm fascinated by the many very old buildings in Newbury. One place that stands out is Shaw House. It's had an amazing history spanning nearly 500 years, and it holds many secrets. As you'll see, when I arrived to tour the house last summer, I was pretty excited.
This is Shaw House in Newbury. It's been called the finest manor house in Berkshire. Currently, it's a conference centre, but when I first moved to Newbury, it was the school that my daughters attended. One of the things that fascinated them was the existence of a small brass plate in one of the rooms that claims to mark a musket shot aimed at the head of King Charles I when he stayed here during the First Battle of Newbury. But here's the problem. These days, it's reckoned by some that the king never stayed here that fateful night, that rather he was billeted in Newbury town. So where did the plate come from? Who fixed it there? And does it really cover a roundhead bullet hole? Let's investigate the history of Shaw House and see what we can uncover. To start, we must go back 500 years to the 15th century, to a time when wool was the commodity from which Britain's wealth was derived. Here in Newbury, the most famous of all the clothiers was John Winchcombe, or Jack of Newbury as he's sometimes known. But the Winchcombes were not the only wealthy clothiers in Newbury. Their contemporaries were the Dolmans. In comparison to the flamboyant legends of Jack of Newbury, Thomas Dolman seems very dull. And yet, as we'll see later on, one of his descendants fought in the Second Battle of Newbury, which is exceptionally dramatic. Thomas Dolman acquired the manor of Shaw, which included not just a small but comfortable country house, but acres of pasture land, just right to graze sheep on. When Thomas Dolman, let's call him Thomas Dolman number 1, died in 1575, he left the estate in Shaw not to his eldest son John, but to his second son, also called Thomas. Why did he do that and not leave it to the eldest son? Well, nobody's quite sure. Clearly the older brother was upset because he contested the will, getting the Shaw estates back. But 2 years later, his brother Thomas had raised enough money to buy the land from him and begin building Shaw House. Thomas number 2 was a man ahead of his time, because Shaw House is an early example of the use of brick, when traditionally Tudor buildings had used a timber frame. And what a beautiful house it is. Thomas had a weird sense of humour, because above the door there's an odd inscription that reads, "Let no envious man enter here." And above that is another inscription that reads, "The toothless man envies the teeth of those who eat, while the mole treats the eyes of the roe deer as of no importance." It was suggested that it was aimed either at his older brother or at his neighbours who envied his wealth. I have to say, it looks very strange to me, because unless you understand Greek or Latin, you'll never get the joke. The house was completed in 1581, by which time Elizabeth I was on the throne. Apparently, she stayed here on one of her tours of the country. This room is probably little changed from that time. The panelling and all the woodwork date from that period, so it's probably all at least 500 years old. Here in the cafe, we can see more features of the original house, including the huge fireplace. But according to the excellent Shaw House guidebook, and I'd encourage everyone to buy a copy, it's absolutely fascinating, there's a hidden treasure beneath us. When they were renovating the building in the early 21st century, they discovered a bake room underneath the floor that was unchanged from those Tudor times, is hidden under that trap door. By the time of Elizabeth I's visit, the cloth trade was beginning to decline, and again, Thomas seems to have been ahead of his time, because soon after finishing the house, he retired from the business. From now on, wealth was to come not from wool, but from the land, and Thomas Dolman had acres of it. 50 years later, the relative stability of English country life was violently upset when the English Civil War broke out between Charles I and the supporters of Parliament. These pockmarks were caused by musket shot from the Second Battle of Newbury that raged here on Sunday, October the 27th, 1644. Humphrey Dolman, the owner of Shaw House at the time, was a parliamentarian, while his 23-year-old son, another Thomas, supported the king. So when in 1644 Charles arrived in Newbury with his army while Dolman Sr. was away, Thomas, the son, gave the king a warm welcome. Unfortunately, the parliamentarians were close behind, and Shaw House soon found itself at the centre of a ferocious battle. Both armies were quite large, with around 19,000 parliamentarian troops spread across an area that in modern day is encompassed by the northwestern stretch of the Newbury bypass. The area was defended by a much smaller Royalist army of little more than half the size. The Royalist army was further stretched when 5,000 Roundhead troops and cavalry were ordered to attack Shaw House from the east. Although the Royalist army was heavily outnumbered, they had the advantage of large defensive embankments around the house, and they inflicted significant casualties on the Roundhead troops. By the evening, after a day of fierce fighting and heavy losses on both sides, neither side had been able to claim the victory, and in the night, the Royalist troops withdrew. Nonetheless, it's said that this battle changed the course of the war, and it was during this battle that, according to legend, a sniper took aim at the king in the first floor bedroom. Now here's the thing. King Charles was never in Shaw House during the battle. He was billeted in Newbury town, and nobody ever reported a sniper taking a pot shot at him. So where did the legend and the brass plate come from? We'll have to wait for 200 years of history to pass before we find the answer. The Dolmans did quite well afterwards and often entertained royalty at Shaw House. 50 years after the Civil War, lots of changes were made to the interior for a visit by Queen Anne in 1703. Originally, the Great Hall was twice the height that it is now. It would have been amazing with all the light that would have flooded in through the double rows of windows. What Thomas Dolman did was to install a complete suite of rooms in the top half of the room. So the ceiling in this room would have once been the ceiling of the room downstairs. To access these new rooms, Dolman built this beautiful oak staircase. Queen Anne obviously enjoyed her stay because soon after her visit, Thomas was given a knighthood. Queen Anne's visit was a high point in the history of the Dolman family. Eventually the house and all its accumulated debts passed to a niece, but her husband, John Talbot, was unable to carry the burden. And so it was that in 1728, 140 years after it was built, Shaw House was sold, and the Dolman family passed into history. The arrival of new owners coincided with an upheaval in world affairs. It was a century of exploration and colonization, and fortunes were being made in the new world of America. Here in England, the 18th century saw the beginning of the Industrial Revolution that shifted the economy away from agriculture to one based on coal and steel. However, most of this was still to come when James Bridges, the Duke of Chandos, bought the house in 1728. He was a member of an aristocratic family that owned estates all over Britain. He paid £28,000 for it, presumably as a country retreat conveniently located halfway between London and his other residence in Bath, and he spent the next 2 or 3 years having the house brought up to date with Georgian style. The Chandos dining room has been restored to its 18th century grandeur with reproductions of the original silk papers as they were known. The most amazing changes that he made were to the grounds. He had a huge canal dug, fed via a waterfall from the river. It must have looked amazing, and it was designed to show a reflection of the house in the water. "20 years later, the house changed hands again, this time to a certain Joseph Andrews. Shortly after buying the house, he died and it passed to his son Joseph Jr. The church just next door has several memorials to various members of the Andrews family. It was during the time of the Andrews family that the wooden corridor was constructed. It was designed to allow the servants to pass from one end of the house to the other end of the house without having to go through the main rooms. Over the next century or so, the house passed through several generations of distant relatives until 1905, when it and its contents were sold again. It was bought by a certain Mrs. Farquhar, who was somewhat of a Downton Abbey type, and she spent a fortune renovating the house and the gardens. In 1907, she caused quite a furore because she erected a gate in Church Road to prevent the traction engines making such a racket as they went past. It all went to court and Mrs. Farquhar lost the case. And in response, she built this wall and these beautiful gates to maintain her privacy. Sadly, during the First World War, her son was killed. His widow and children came to stay with their grandmother, and there they all lived until the Second World War broke out, and the house was requisitioned by the government, ending about 3.5 centuries as a family home. After the war, the house became a school, and so it would probably have remained had not some structural issues forced the closing of the house, and the pupils were moved into temporary accommodation on the East Lawn. Eventually, the school was moved into modern purpose-built classrooms next door, and millions were spent renovating the old house. It's now the setting for weddings and business seminars. But what about that legendary musket ball? If King Charles never stayed here, where did the legend come from? We have to go back to about 1750 to find the answer, to the time of Joseph Andrews Jr., whose father had bought the house from the Duke of Chandos. Joseph Andrews' brother James was a well-known historian, writing lots of books on the subject, and Shaw House and its powerful connection with the Civil War filled him with great fascination. It was James who encouraged his brother to name the rooms after Queen Anne, Oliver Cromwell and Charles I, names that have stuck through the centuries right up to the present day. So James Andrews is the most likely candidate for the invention of the famous musket hole, and it was probably he who had the brass plate installed. 2.5 centuries later, it's this that's the most well-known detail of Shaw House. But does it cover a real musket hole? Well, who knows? And who really cares? The real history of Shaw House is so exciting, poignant and fascinating that I'm delighted to find such a magnificent place right on my doorstep, and I absolutely encourage you to visit.